Hello! Happy Monday. Welcome back. Another day, another quarantine. And it's time for quarantine story time. And we still have a little ways to go on this. So we're working on War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. That's weird. It's weird. It almost looked like my thing refreshed. War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy. Welcome back, everybody. Oh, my hair is crazy today. I don't know what it's doing. So we're in the middle of war. Hey, Mom. We're in the middle of the war, and we're right now hoping that Bonaparte's troops don't rout the Russian troops and kill all of our favorite characters. So that's where we're at. If it's your first time, welcome. For those of you who are back, welcome back. You can always check out more from the War and Peace playlist that I have on my channel. A few notes. There's a lot of languages in this book. I thought it would just be crazy Russian names that I was going to slaughter, but there's a lot of French and German and even some Italian. So who knows? Just bear with me. We'll all do the best we can. I would like to say that I read ahead and studied this, but there's 4 pounds of book, so I did not. Sorry. So that being said, I'm reading it fresh with you, so we all get this live and instantaneous experience, which we love. That's what the current culture is, instantaneous gratification of the moment for the next 30 minutes. So, again, bear with me if it seems a little foreign to me, because it is! We're all having this experience together. Yay! Also, I've been told that the sound might be a little tinny. I am recording this from my laptop, so the microphone on here might not be great. I will look into getting maybe a better microphone, so hopefully we can improve sound quality. But that being said, thank you for those of you who keep tuning in despite the lack of fancy tech. So today we're going to read from Volume 1, Part 2, Sections 15, 16, and 17. That should be enough for today. And hopefully we'll see where we end. And as we left off, there were the main Russian army, and there was a smaller group that got split off to try to come between the main Russian army, which was traveling along from, I think, Krems to Znaim. The name of the place is Znaim. Traveling along with all like the heavy artillery and the guns and everything. Main army's traveling along. Bonaparte's troops is coming from like Vienna over here. They're gonna get there first, destroy them. Ah! So we have the other smaller vanguard force, which is breaking off and faster. It's gonna move through the hills, blah, 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 take the side road, whatever have you, and get between main army and the main Russian army and Bonaparte's army and try to stall. It's like 3,000 guys against 120,000 guys-ish. And these guys are going to try to hold these guys off so these guys can get over here and get into position so that they can also defend themselves and not completely have the whole army destroyed. So that's where we're at right now. And for a minute, it looked like well, first of all, it seemed impossible. And then for a minute, it looked like that the generals of some of Bonaparte's generals thought this small force was the whole Russian army. And so they were going to just have a little peace accord for a minute so they could like get around them and like, we defeated them. But that little peace accord might have been enough time to buy the main Russian army enough time to get back behind here to help them out, to help the rest of the vanguard forces out. So Bonaparte saw through the whole thing and was like, guys, just attack. You're losing your window of opportunity. And that's basically where we're at, where he's like, you guys are idiots. My general are fools. You must attack now because we are losing our opportunity. And the Russians are like, oh, please don't attack. That's where we are right now. So we'll see. if there was enough time for our favorite Russian forces to make it, or if Bonaparte's generals are going to wise up and kill them all. That's my summary. All right. And if you need more than that, look at the War and Peace playlist for the reading. It will be maybe a little bit better than that summary. Hey, let's go. Section 15. It was past 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Prince Andrei, who had persuaded Kutuzov to grant his request, arrived in Grund and went to Bagration's the dude who's the leader of the vanguard forces. Bonaparte's adjutant, I think I'm saying that right now, had not yet reached Murat's division, and the battle had not yet begun. In Bagration's division, nothing was known about the general course of affairs. They talked of peace, but did not believe in its possibility. They talked of battle, and also did not believe in the nearness of battle. Bagration, knowing of Volokhonsky to be a favorite and trusted adjutant, received him with a superior officer's special distinction and indulgence, explained to him that there would probably be a battle that day or the next, and allowed him full freedom to stay by him during the battle or to supervise the order of retreat in the rear guard, which was also very important. However, there would probably be no action today, said Bagration, as if to soothe Prince Andrei. If he's one of those ordinary staff dandies sent to earn himself a little cross, he can earn it just as well in the rear guard, but if he wants to be with me, let him. He'll be useful if he's a brave officer, thought Bagration. Prince Andrei, having said nothing, asked permission to go around the lines and learn the disposition of the forces so as to know where to go in case of an errand. The officer on duty in the detachment, a handsome man, foppishly dressed and with a diamond ring on his index finger, who spoke French poorly but eagerly, like me, volunteered to accompany Prince Andrei. On all sides, one saw wet, sad-faced officers who seemed to be looking for something, and soldiers who were dragging doors, benches, and fences from the village. You see, Prince, we can't get rid of ourselves of these folk, said the staff officer, pointing to them. The commanders neglect discipline, and here, he pointed to a sutler's tent, they crowd in and sit. This morning I drove them all out. Look, it's full again. We must ride over, Prince, and scare them away, for a moment. Let's go in. I'll have some bread and cheese, said Prince Andrei, who had not yet had time to eat. Why didn't you tell me, Prince? I'd have offered you my hospitality. They dismounted and went into the sutler's tent. Several officers with flushed and languorous faces were sitting at tables, drinking and eating. Well, what is this, gentlemen? The staff officer said in a tone of reproach, like a man who has already repeated the same thing several times. You can't absent yourselves like this. The prince ordered that nobody should be found here. Well, take you, Mr. Staff Captain, he addressed a small, dirty, thin artillery officer who was standing bootless before the entering men. He had given his boots to the sutler to dry. Just in his stockings, smiling, not quite naturally. Well, Captain Tushin, aren't you ashamed? The staff officer went on. It would seem that you, an artillerist, ought to have set an example, and here you are bootless. They'll sound the alarm, and a fine one you'll be with no boots on. The staff officer smiled. Kindly go back to your post, gentlemen. All of you, he added in a superior tone. Prince Andrei smiled involuntarily, looking at Captain Tushin. Silent and smiling, Tushin shifted from one bare foot to the other, looked questioningly with his large, intelligent, and kindly eyes, first at Prince Andrei, then at the staff officer. Soldiers say it's nimbler barefoot, said Captain Tushin with a timorous smile, evidently wishing to turn his awkward position into a joke. But before he finished, he felt that his joke was unsuccessful and had not gone over. He became embarrassed. Kindly go, said the staff officer, trying to maintain his seriousness. Prince Andrei looked once more at the little figure of the artillerist. There was something special in it, totally unmilitary, slightly comical, but extremely attractive. The staff officer and Prince Andrei got on their horses and rode further. Having left the village, constantly meeting and going ahead of walking soldiers, officers of various detachments, they saw to their left the reddish, fresh, newly dug clay of the fortification under construction. Several battalions of soldiers in nothing but their shirts, despite the cold wind, were swarming like white ants over this fortification. Someone invisible kept shoveling out red clay from behind the rampart. They rode up to the fortification, examined it, and rode on. Just behind the fortification, they ran into several dozen soldiers, constantly replacing each other, running down the rampart. They had to hold their noses and set their horses at a trot to get away from that poisoned atmosphere. Voilà l'agrément des camps, monsieur le prince, said the staff officer on duty. They rode to the opposite hill. From this hill they could already see the French. Prince Andrei stopped and began to examine. Here's where our battery stands, said the staff officer, indicating the highest point. The one of that odd bird who was sitting there without boots. You can see everything from here. Let's go, Prince. I humbly thank you. I'll go by myself now, said Prince Andrei, wishing to rid himself of the staff officer. Don't trouble yourself, please. The staff officer stayed behind, and Prince Andrei rode on alone. The further ahead he moved, the closer to the enemy, the more orderly and cheerful the troops looked. The greater disorder and despondency had been in that baggage train before Znaim, which Prince Andrei had circled around in the morning, and which was some 7 miles away from the French. In Grund there was also a feeling of a certain alarm and fear of something, but the closer Prince Andrei rode to the French line, the more self-assured our troops looked. Lined up in ranks, the soldiers stood in their greatcoats, and a sergeant major and a company commander counted heads, jabbing a finger towards the last soldier in the row, and ordering him to raise his hand. Scattered all over the area, soldiers were carrying firewood and brushwood and building little lean-tos, laughing merrily and talking among themselves. Some sat by campfires, dressed or naked, drying their shirts and footcloths, or mending boots and greatcoats, crowding around the cauldrons and cooks. In one company, dinner was ready, and the soldiers looked greedily at the steaming cauldrons, waiting until an officer, who was sitting on a log facing his lean-to, tried the kasha and brought to him in a wooden bowl by a quartermaster sergeant. In another, more fortunate company, since not all of them had vodka, soldiers crowded around a pockmarked, broad-shouldered sergeant major, who, tipping a keg, poured into the canteen cups that the soldiers held out in turn. The soldiers, with pious faces, brought the cups to their mouth, upended them, and rinsing their mouths and wiping them on their greatcoat sleeves, walked away from the sergeant major with cheered faces. All the faces were as calm as though everything was happening not in view of the enemy, prior to an action in which at least half the division would be left on the field, but somewhere in their home country in expectation of a peaceful stay. Having passed the regiment of chasseurs and through the lines of the Kievsky grenadiers, brave folk occupied with the same peaceful affairs, Prince Andrei drew near the tall lean-to, unlike the others, of the regimental commander, and came out to a lined-up platoon of grenadiers before whom lay a stripped man. 2 soldiers were holding him, and 2 swinging supple switches were beating him rhythmically on his stripped back. The punished man was crying out unnaturally. A fat major walked in front of the line and, paying no attention to the cries, ceaselessly repeated, "It is a disgrace for a soldier to steal. A soldier should be honest, noble, and brave, and if one steals from his comrade, there is no honor in him. He is a scoundrel. More! More!" Again came the supple strokes and a desperate but feigned cry. "More! More!" repeated the major. A young officer, with an expression of perplexity and suffering on his face, walked away from the punished man, looking questioningly at the passing adjutant. Prince Andrei, having reached the front line, rode along it. Our line and the enemy's stood far from each other on the left and right flanks, but in the center, where the envoys had passed that morning, the lines came so close that the men could see each other's faces and talk to each other. Besides the soldiers who occupied the line at that place, many of the curious stood on both sides and gazed, laughing at their strange and foreign-looking enemies. Since early morning, though it was forbidden to go near the line, the officers had been unable to ward off the curious. The soldiers stationed on the line, like people displaying something rare, no longer looked at the French, but made their observations to those who came, and, languishing, waited to be relieved. Prince Andrei stopped to examine the French. "Look, look," one soldier said to his comrade, pointing to a Russian musketeer who had gone up to the line along with an officer and was speaking rapidly and heatedly with a French grenadier. "See how clever he patters away. Even the Frenchmen can't keep up with him. Now you, Sidorov—" "Wait, listen, that's really clever," replied Sidorov, who was considered an expert at speaking French. The soldier at whom the laughing men were pointing was Dolokhov. Prince Andrei recognized him and listened to what he was saying. Dolokhov and his company commander had gone to the line from the left flank where their regiment was stationed. Go on, more, the company commander egged him on, leaning forward and trying not to miss a single incomprehensible word. Thicker and faster, what's he saying? Dolokhov did not answer his company commander. He was involved in a heated argument with the French grenadier. They were talking, as they could only have been, about the campaign. The Frenchman, confusing the Austrians with the Russians, insisted that the Russians had surrendered and fled all the way from Ulm. Dolokhov insisted that the Russians had not surrendered, but had beaten the French. We have orders to drive you away, and that's what we're going to do, said Dolokhov. Only try hard not to get captured with all your Cossacks, said the French grenadier. The French onlookers and listeners laughed. We'll make you dance as you danced for Suvorov. On vous fera danser, said Dolokhov. Qu'est-ce qu'il chantait? Said one Frenchman. De la histoire ancienne, said a third, realizing that the talk was about former wars. L'empereur va lui faire voir et votre souverain comme les autres. Bonaparte, Dolokhov began, but the Frenchman interrupted him. There is no Bonaparte. There is the emperor. Sacre nom, he cried angrily. Devil take your emperor. And Dolokhov produced a rude soldier's curse and, shouldering his gun, walked off. Come on, Ivan Lukich, he said to the company commander. That's the French for you, the soldier said, talking in the line. Now you, Sidorov. Sidorov winked and, turning to the French, began pouring out a thick patter of incomprehensible words. Kari mala tafa safi mutur kaska, he pattered, trying to give his voice expressive intonations. Ho, 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 ha, 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 ho, ho. Peals of such healthy and merry guffawing came from among the soldiers that it crossed the line and involuntarily infected the French, after which it seemed they ought quickly to unload their guns, blow up their munitions, and all quickly go back home. But the guns remained loaded, the loopholes in the houses and fortifications looked out just as menacingly, and the unlimbered cannon remained turned against each other just as before. Section 16. Having ridden all along the line of troops from the right flank to the left, Prince Andrei went up to the battery, from which, according to the staff officer's words, one could see the whole field. Here he got off his horse and stopped by the last of the 4 unlimbered cannon. In front of the cannon placed an artillery sentry, who snapped to attention before the officer, but at a sign from him renewed his measured, tedious pacing. Behind the cannon stood their limbers. Further behind, a hitching rail and the campfires of the artillerists. To the left, not far from the last cannon, there was a newly plated lean-to from which came the animated voices of the officers. Indeed, from the battery, a view opened out of almost the entire disposition of the Russian troops and the greater part of the enemy's. Directly facing the battery, on the crest of the knoll opposite, one could see the village of Schöngraben. To the left and right, it was possible to make out in 3 places amidst the smoke of their campfires the masses of the French troops, of whom the greater part were evidently in the village itself and behind the hill. To the left of the village, in the smoke, appeared something resembling a battery, but it was impossible to see it well with the naked eye. Our right flank was disposed on a rather steep elevation, which dominated the position of the French. On it, our infantry was disposed, and at the very end one could see the dragoons. In the center, where Tushin's battery stood, from where Prince Andrei was surveying the position, there was a gently sloping and direct descent and ascent to the stream that separated us from Schöngraben. To the left, our troops adjoined a wood, where smoked the campfires of our infantry, who were cutting firewood. The French line was wider than ours, and it was obvious that the French could easily encircle us from both sides. Behind our position was a steep and deep ravine, through which it would be hard for artillery and cavalry to retreat. Prince Andrei, leaning his elbow on the cannon and taking out his notebook, drew a plan of the disposition of the troops for himself. In 2 places he penciled some notes, intending to tell Bagration about them. He proposed, first, to concentrate all the artillery in the center, second, to transfer the cavalry back to the other side of the ravine. Prince Andrei had been constantly at the commander-in-chief's side, had followed the movements of masses and the general orders, and had constantly been taken up with historical descriptions of battles, and in this forthcoming action involuntarily considered the future course of the military operations only in general terms. He pictured only major occurrences of the following kind. If the enemy mounts an attack on the right flank, he said to himself, the Kievsky Grenadiers and the Podolsky chasseurs will have to hold their positions until the reserves from the center can reach them. In that case, the dragoons can strike at the flank and overthrow them. In case of an attack at the center, we can deploy the central battery on this elevation and under its cover pull back to the left flank and retreat into the ravine by echelons, he reasoned to himself. All the while he was in the battery by the cannon, as often happens, he had never stopped hearing the sounds of the officers' voices talking in the lean-to, but had not understood a single word of what they were saying. Suddenly, the sound of voices from the lean-to struck him with such soul-felt tones that he involuntarily began to listen. No, dear heart, spoke a pleasant voice, which seemed familiar to Prince Andrei. I say that if it were possible to know what there will be after death, none of us would be afraid of death. That's so, dear heart. Another, younger voice interrupted him. Afraid or not, all the same, you can't avoid it. But you're still afraid. You learned people, said a third, manly voice, interrupting the other two. That's why you artillerists are so learned, because you can tote everything along with you, both vodka and grub. And the owner of the manly voice, probably an infantryman, laughed. But you're still afraid, the first, familiar voice went on. Afraid of the unknown, that's what. However much we say that the soul will go to heaven, we know that there is no heaven, only atmosphere. Again the manly voice interrupted the artillerist. Well, let's have some of your herb liqueur, Tushin, it said. Ah, that's the same captain who stood without boots in the canteen, thought Prince Andrei, glad to have identified the pleasant, philosophizing voice. Herb liqueurs possible, said Tushin, but even so, to understand future life, he did not finish. Just then a whistling was heard in the air. Closer, closer, faster and louder, louder and faster, and a cannonball, as if not finishing all it had to say, crashed to the ground with an inhuman force not far from the lean-to, throwing up a spray of dirt. The earth seemed to gasp from the terrible blow. At the same moment, little Tushin came running out of the lean-to ahead of everyone else, his pipe askew in his teeth, his kindly, intelligent face was slightly pale. After him, the owner of the manly voice came out, a dashing infantry officer, and ran to his company, buttoning himself up as he ran. Section 17. Prince Andrei mounted up and stayed at the battery, looking at the smoke of the cannon from which the cannonball had come flying. His eyes ran over the vast space. He saw only that the previously immobile masses of the French began to sway, that there was indeed a battery to the left. The smoke there had not yet dispersed. 2 French horsemen, probably adjutants, were galloping over the hill. A small column of the enemy, clearly visible, was moving down the hillside, probably to reinforce the line. The smoke of the first shot had not scattered when another puff had appeared, followed by a report. The battle had begun. Prince Andrei turned his horse and rode back to Grund to look for Prince Bagration. Behind him, he heard the cannonade growing louder and heavier. Evidently ours had begun to respond. Below, in the place where the envoys had massed, musket fire was beginning. Lemorrois had just come galloping to Murat with the menacing letter from Bonaparte, and the shamed Murat, wishing to smooth over his mistake, at once moved his troops up to the center and around both flanks, hoping before evening and the emperor's arrival to crush the insignificant detachment that stood facing him. It's begun! Here it is! Thought Prince Andrei, feeling the blood beginning to rush more quickly to his heart. But where then? How will my Toulon declare itself, he thought. Riding among the same companies that had been eating kasha and drinking vodka a quarter of an hour ago, he saw everywhere the same quick movements of soldiers lining up, taking their muskets, and on all faces he recognized the feeling of animation that was in his heart. It's begun! Here it is! Fearful and merry, spoke the face of every soldier and officer. Before he reached the still unfinished fortification, he saw horsemen moving towards him in the evening light of the gray autumnal day. The foremost, in a felt coat and peaked astrakhan hat, was riding a white horse. It was Prince Bagration. Prince Andrei stood waiting for him. Prince Bagration reined in his horse and, recognizing Prince Andrei, nodded to him. He went on looking ahead all the while Prince Andrei was telling him what he had seen. The expression, "It's begun, here it is," was even on the firm, swarthy face of Prince Bagration, with its half-closed eyes, lackluster as if from want of sleep. Prince Andrei peered into that immobile face with anxious curiosity, and wished to know whether this man thought and felt and what he thought and what felt at that moment. Is there anything there behind that immobile face? Prince Andrei asked himself, looking at him. Prince Bagration inclined his head as a sign of assent to Prince Andrei's words and said, "Very good," with such an expression as if everything that was taking place and that had been reported to him was precisely what he had already foreseen. Prince Andrei, breathless from fast riding, spoke quickly. Prince Bagration pronounced words especially slowly, with his oriental accent, as if to suggest that they were not hurrying anywhere. Nevertheless, he started his horse at a trot towards Tushin's battery. Prince Andrei and the suite followed behind him. Behind Prince Bagration rode an officer of the suite, the prince's personal adjutant, Zherkov, an orderly officer, the staff officer on duty, on a handsome bobtailed horse, and a state councillor, an auditor, who had asked to come to the battle out of curiosity. The auditor, a plump man with a plump face and a naive smile of joy, looked around him, jolting along on his horse, and made a strange sight in his camlet coat, on a government-issue saddle, along with the hussars, Cossacks, and adjutants. "See, he wants to have a look at a battle," Zherkov said to Volokhonsky, pointing to the auditor, "but he's got a knot in the pit of his stomach." "Well enough from you," the auditor said with a beaming smile, and naive, and at the same time sly, as if he were flattered to be the butt of Zherkov's jokes, and as if he were deliberately trying to seem stupider than he really was. "Très drôle, mon monsieur prince," said the staff officer on duty. He remembered that there was some special way of addressing a prince in French, but was unable to get it right. Just then they were all approaching Tushin's battery, and a cannonball landed in front of them. "What fell?" the auditor asked, smiling naively. "French pancakes," said Zherkov. "So that's what they hit you with?" asked the auditor. "How frightful!" And he seemed to melt all over with satisfaction. He had barely finished speaking when there again came an unexpected, dreadful whistle, suddenly ending in a thud against something liquid and a flop. A Cossack, riding a little to the right and behind the auditor, crashed to the ground with his horse. Zherkov and the staff officer on duty crouched low in their saddles and turned their horses away. The auditor stopped in front of the Cossack, examining him with attentive curiosity. The Cossack was dead, and the horse was still thrashing. Prince Bagration, narrowing his eyes, turned to look, and, seeing the cause of the confusion, looked away indifferently as if to say, "Is it worth bothering with such stupidities?" He stopped his horse the way a good rider does, bent over a little, and straightened his sword, which had caught in his felt coat. The sword was an old one, not the kind men wore now. Prince Andrei recalled the story of how Suvorov had made a gift of his sword to the Bagration in Italy, and this recollection was especially pleasing to him at this moment. They rode up to the battery near which Volokhonsky had stood when he examined the battlefield. "Whose company?" Bagration asked a fireworker standing by the caissons. He asked, "Whose company?" but essentially was asking, "You're not scared here, are you?" And the fireworker understood that. "Captain Tushin's, Your Excellency," the red-haired, freckled-faced fireworker cried out in a merry voice, snapping to attention. So, said Bagration, calculating something, and rode past the limbers to the end cannon. While he was on his way there, a shot rang out from that cannon, deafening him and his suite, and in the smoke that suddenly surrounded the cannon, one could see the artillerist seize hold of it and, straining hurriedly, pulled it back to its former place. The broad-shouldered, enormous soldier, number 1, with a swab in his hand, his legs spread wide, jumped over to the wheel. Number 2 was loading a charge in the muzzle with a trembling hand. A small, stooping man, the officer Tushin, stumbled over the trail, ran forward, not noticing the general, and peering from under his small hand. "Add 2 more notches and it'll be just right," he shouted in a high-pitched voice, trying to give it a dashing sound, which did not go with his little figure. "Number 2, he squeaked. "Smash him, Medvedev!" Bagration called to the officer, and Tushin went over to the general, pushing 3 fingers to his visor in a timid and awkward movement, not as military men salute, but as priests bless. Though Tushin's guns were meant to be shooting into the hollow, he was sending fireballs at the village of Schöngraben, visible straight ahead, before which large masses of French were moving forward. No one had given Tushin any orders about where to shoot or with what, and having consulted his sergeant major Zakharchenko, for whom he had great respect, he had decided it would be good to set fire to the village. Very good, Bagration said to the officer's report, and he began to survey the whole battlefield opened out before him, as if calculating something. On the right side, the French had come nearest of all. Below the elevation on which the Kievsky regiment stood, in the river hollow, the soul-wrenching roll and crackle of musket fire could be heard. And much further to the right, beyond the dragoons, the officer of the suite pointed out to the prince a column of the French turning on our flank. To the left, the horizon was limited by the neighboring woods. Prince Bagration ordered 2 battalions from the center to go as reinforcements to the right. The officer of the suite ventured to observe to the prince that, with those 2 battalions gone, the cannon would remain exposed. Prince Bagration turned to the officer of the suite and looked at him silently with his lackluster eyes. It seemed to Prince Andrei that the officer of the suite's observation was correct, and there was indeed nothing to say. But just then, an adjutant came galloping from the regimental commander who was in the hollow with a report that huge masses of the French were coming from below, that the regiment was in disarray and was falling back towards the Kievsky grenadiers. Prince Bagration inclined his head as a sign of assent and approval. He rode to the right at a walk and sent an adjutant to the dragoons with an order to attack the French. But the adjutant sent there came back half an hour later with the report that the regimental commander of the dragoons had already pulled back beyond the ravine because of heavy fire had been directed at him and he had been losing men uselessly, and therefore he had dismounted his riflemen in the wood. Very good, said Prince Bagration. As he was riding away from the battery, shots were also heard to the left in the woods, as it was too far from the left flank for him to get there in time himself. Prince Bagration sent Zherkov there to tell the senior general, the one who had presented the regiment in Kutuzov in Braunau, to pull back beyond the ravine as quickly as possible, because the right flank would probably be unable to hold the enemy for long. Tushin and the battalion covering him were forgotten. Prince Andrei listened carefully to Prince Bagration's exchanges with the commanders and to the orders given, and noticed, to his surprise, that no orders were given, and that Prince Bagration had only tried to pretend that all that was done, by necessity, chance, or the will of a particular commander, that it was all done, if not on his orders, then in accord with his intentions. Owing to the tact shown by Prince Bagration, Prince Andrei noticed that, in spite of the chance character of events and their independence of the commander's will, his presence accomplished a very great deal. Commanders who rode up to Prince Bagration with troubled faces became calm. Soldiers and officers greeted him merrily and became more animated in his presence, and obviously showed off their courage before him. Interesting. Interesting. So Bagration, while in charge, doesn't seem to, I guess, be doing a whole lot more than providing sort of moral or like mental fortitude to these men. That seems to be the point they're getting at the end. And that's the end of 17. So that's where we'll stop for today. And in case I read it a little too fast, the left flank, which is the one in the woods, is the regiment that we read about being presented to Kutuzov and Braunau. They were the ones who were like, they got a message and they weren't sure if they were supposed to be dressed up or dressed down, so they dressed up, and they were supposed to be dressed down, so then they changed. And I think Dolokhov was in that regiment. And he was the one who got called out for wearing a blue coat instead of a gray coat or something, as you may recall. So the battle has started now in earnest. All right. Well, we will leave it there for today because I'm sure there'll be at least a little bit more war, some here in the next 1,000 pages or so. And let me know if you guys have any comments. I always have the live chat going, or if you have any questions, but you can also drop them comments on the videos after. Thank you guys for tuning in on this lovely Monday morning. Some interesting characters. Be interesting to see. I think that's all for today. So, without further ado, thank you all very much, and we'll see you again tomorrow, around 3. Have a great day.